Welcome back, my friends. Settle in and enjoy the stories. Nothing here will wake you. Sleep well. The National Weather Service put out the flash flood warning for the Terlingua Creek drainage at 4:52 in the afternoon, which in Big Bend during monsoon season is not unusual enough on its own to clear the backcountry. What made that evening different was a name on a permit board that hadn't checked back in. Marcus Whitfield. Solo overnight. Self-issued route down through Fresno Canyon toward the river, due out by 6. Monsoon season in this park runs roughly July through September, and every ranger who's worked more than one of them develops the same quiet vigilance around the permit board once the afternoon clouds start building over the Chisos. Not panic. Just panic. Just. A habit of counting names against the clock, cross-referencing routes against drainage basins, doing the math on who's down in a slot canyon when a cell finally breaks open somewhere upstream of them. Most years it amounts to nothing worse than a soaked, embarrassed group of day hikers waiting out a storm under an overhang. Every few years it amounts to something else, and you don't get to know in advance which kind of year you're in until the radio traffic starts. His permit was thorough in the way solo permits usually are for people who've done this before. Prior trips logged in 3 different districts, a full gear list, an emergency contact who knew his itinerary well enough to describe it back to. Dispatch almost word for word when we called her. None of that told us anything was wrong yet. It told us, if anything, that he was the kind of hiker who shouldn't have gone quiet, which somehow made the silence worse rather than better. The emergency contact, his sister, said the last thing he'd told her before losing signal on the drive down from Marathon, was that he wanted a night alone in the canyon before a work deadline swallowed his next several weekends. The ordinary, unremarkable kind of plan that 1,000 solo backpackers make every season in this park without incident. She wasn't panicked when we called. Not yet. Just precise in the way people get when they're holding panic at a careful distance, giving us his exact vehicle description, his exact planned route, the exact brand of headlamp he carried, because giving useful information is sometimes the only thing left to do with fear that has nowhere else to go. I was working dispatch out of Panther Junction that week, filling in for a ranger on leave, which mostly means answering radio traffic and hoping the night stays quiet. It didn't. By 8 o'clock, with no sign of Marcus at the trailhead and storm cells still stacking up over the Chisos, visible now and then as long, silent strobes of lightning with no thunder yet behind them, the district called it full search. 4 teams. Technical rescue gear staged in case the wash had done what washes do out here, which is turn a dry gravel bed into 8 feet of moving water in under 20 minutes. I'd worked 6 seasons at Big Bend by then, most of them quiet in the way desert parks are quiet. Long stretches of nothing punctuated by heat emergencies, and the occasional overconfident hiker who underestimated how fast an afternoon storm can turn. A dry arroyo lethal. I had been on exactly 1 flash flood rescue before that night. My second season, a father and daughter caught crossing Tornillo Creek who'd made it to high ground on their own before we even reached them. Soaked and shaking but unhurt, already halfway to laughing about it by the time we got a rope across to help them down. I remembered that call mostly for one detail I'd never quite been able to explain to my own satisfaction. The father describing the flood afterward while his daughter wrapped herself in an emergency blanket and ate an entire bag of trail mix in about 90 seconds, kept saying the water had arrived from the wrong direction. Not down canyon the way that they drainage obviously ran, but from a side wash that, when we checked it the next morning in daylight, turned out to be bone dry and had clearly been dry for weeks. No debris, no scour marks, nothing to suggest so much as a trickle had moved through it in the recent past. I'd filed it as adrenaline and bad memory at the time, the ordinary kind of distortion that comes from a few genuinely terrifying seconds in cold, fast water. I hadn't thought about him in years. 6 years later, hiking into Fresno Canyon behind a storm that hadn't fully passed, I found myself thinking about him again for the first time in a long while, and not entirely sure why the memory had chosen that particular night to resurface. If you're still awake, now is the moment to subscribe. In an hour you won't want to move. Then the next one finds you on its own. Where were we? Big Bend's washes are simple in theory. Water falls high, water runs low, and every drainage in that country empties eventually into the Rio Grande, which sits at the bottom of everything. The whole park tilted gently toward it over millions of years of erosion, cutting through volcanic rock and old seabed limestone. You learn the grade of a canyon with your feet before you learn it from any map. And Fresno Canyon has a grade I'd walked a dozen times. A steady 4-5% drop, west to east. The kind you barely notice until you're breathing harder on the way back out, climbing against gravity that has always, until that night, behaved exactly the way gravity is supposed to. The park's geology is old and violent in a way that's easy to forget standing in the quiet of an ordinary afternoon. 40 million years of volcanic activity, calderas and lava flows and ash falls stacked and eroded and stacked again, the whole laid and stacked again. Landscape a kind of frozen record of catastrophe that has since gone still. Fresno Canyon cuts through several distinct layers of that history in the space of a few miles. Softer ashfall tuff giving way to harder basalt caps further downstream, each layer holding water differently, draining differently, which is part of why predicting exactly how a given storm will move through this particular canyon has always been more art than the science Denise's models like to pretend it was. I'd learned to read those layers the slow way, the way you learn most things in this job, by being wrong about them a few times early in your career, and remembering the specific ways you were wrong. I paired with a seasonal ranger named Denise Okoro. 2 years in the park, sharp, methodical. The kind of person who reads a topo map the way other people read a room, and who'd spent her first season doing hydrology fieldwork for the district before. Switching over to interpretation and search and rescue, which meant she understood these washes better on paper than almost anyone else on staff, and had a healthy, professional respect for how badly paper can fail to describe what a flash flood actually does to a canyon in real time. She'd told me once, on a slow patrol months earlier, that the thing nobody explains to new hydrology techs is how much of the science is really just careful pattern recognition applied to something that refuses to be fully predictable. You can model a drainage basin's peak discharge within a reasonable margin. You can map where the water should go given the terrain. And then you go stand in the actual canyon during an actual flood and watch it do something your model didn't quite capture. Not because the model was wrong exactly, but because a real canyon has 10,000 small variables no model bothers to include. I'd liked that about her from the start, the way she held her own expertise loosely enough to keep being curious about the ways reality declined to match it. We geared up fast. Headlamps, radios, a rope bag each, first aid kits built for exposure and impact trauma both. Because a flash flood rescue can mean either or sometimes both. Plus a satellite communicator in case the storm knocked out repeater. Coverage the way it sometimes does when lightning gets close enough to the wrong ridge. Denise checked my pack the way I checked hers, out of the same habit Dale had described to me once at a joint training years earlier. An inherited discipline that had apparently spread across more than one park's rescue culture without either Noah district knowing it from the other. The access road into Lower Fresno was already compromised by runoff by the time we reached it. A sheet of brown water moving fast enough across the low crossing that Denise made the call to leave the truck and go in on foot from the higher trailhead. Instead, adding 40 minutes to our approach that neither of us begrudged, because arriving alive and slightly late beats the alternative every time. She radioed that decision back to the district before we started walking. Standard practice, so that whoever was coordinating from Panther Junction knew exactly where our 2 sets of boots were before cell and radio coverage started doing whatever rate coverage does in a canyon during a storm, which is to say, disappearing without warning and returning just as unpredictably. We took the west approach into Fresno Canyon on foot, headlamps cutting a narrow tunnel through rain that hadn't reached us yet, but you could hear coming. Somewhere up canyon, a sound like gravel being poured from a great height, steady and toward. Continuous in a way that ordinary rain never quite manages. Denise walked a half step ahead of me for most of that approach, calling out drainage features as we passed them the way she always did, half professional habit and half something closer to respect. This side channel, that pour off, this old flood channel, that pour off, this old flood. Terrace 20 feet above the current streamed, evidence of a bigger flood decades before either of us was born. The canyon walls here are volcanic tuff, mostly, pale and soft-edged compared to the harder rock further east in the park, weathered into rounded shoulders and shallow overhangs that would, in daylight, look almost gentle. At night, under storm cloud with no moon to soften the shadows, they did something else entirely. Every overhang became a place something could be standing without your headlamp catching it until you were nearly on top of it. Every side channel mouth opening onto darkness deeper than the beam could reach. Denise noticed me checking one overhang a beat too long and said, without breaking stride, "Nothing lives out here that wants to meet you tonight more than you want to meet it," which was true and practical, and didn't make the walking any easier. We talked in low voices between drainage callouts about an old story every ranger at this district eventually hears from someone more senior. Not a ghost story exactly. Nobody here tells actual ghost stories, but a kind of professional folklore about certain washes that run wrong after big storms, a phrase with no official definition that gets passed down anyway, usually accompanied by a shrug and a line about how the desert plays tricks on tired eyes. Denise said she'd heard 3 different versions of it from 3 different rangers over her 2 seasons, no 2 of them describing the same wash, which she found more unsettling than comforting, since a rumor repeating in the same place at least has. A location you could go check. About 1.5 miles in, the rain finally caught us, not the heavy monsoon downpour the warning had promised, but a steady, businesslike rain that soaked through within minutes and made the headlamp beams into solid cones of falling light. We picked up the pace, both of us doing the same silent math. Marcus, 6 hours overdue now, somewhere in a canyon that was actively, at that moment, doing the thing canyons like this do worst. We found the first sign that something about that night wasn't behaving the way it should have about 2 miles in. At a section of exposed stream freshly scoured by a flash flood that had already come through and gone, moving fast enough upstream of us that we could still hear the tail end of it working through the narrows further up canyon. The scoured bed showed a clean debris line, branches, a torn strap of blue nylon webbing, the kind of drift material floodwater leaves stacked against anything solid enough to catch it. Denise crouched next to it with her headlamp and went quiet for a second longer than felt normal, the particular stillness of someone rechecking something they were sure they already understood correctly. "That's uphill," she said. I didn't understand what she meant until I looked at it properly. The debris wasn't stacked against the downstream side of the boulders, the way 12 years of Big Bend flash floods had taught both of us to expect. It was stacked against the upstream side, piled up on the high-grade edge, as if the water that carried it had been moving against the canyon's own slope, climbing instead of falling. Denise ran the numbers out loud as we crouched there, the way she always did when something needed to make sense before she could move past it. Maybe a back eddy. Maybe a debris jam upstream that had briefly reversed a side channel and shoved this, reversed a side channel and shoved this particular pile the wrong way before the main flow reasserted itself. Some hydraulic explanation neither of us had personally seen in 12 combined years in this park, but which had to exist, because water does not run uphill. Not really, not ever, not ever. Not even for a few strange seconds in a narrow canyon during a flash flood. She photographed it from 3 angles, logged the coordinates, and we kept moving because a debris line pointing the wrong direction is strange, But it isn't an emergency. And somewhere further up that canyon, a man was still missing in weather. The canyon, a man was still missing in weather. Had already proven it could kill. We found a second version of the same wrongness less than a quarter-mile further, and this one neither of us tried very hard to explain out loud. A shallow side pool, backed up against a limestone shelf, held a scatter of gravel and small stones that should have washed downstream with everything else the flood had carried. Instead, they sat in a loose, almost deliberate arc along the pool's upper edge, sorted roughly by size the way water sorts sediment when it's moving with purpose and direction. Except the direction the sorting pointed was straight up the drainage. Back the way we'd come, back toward the trailhead, away from the river that every drop of water in that canyon was supposed to be racing toward. Denise didn't crouch over that one as long. She looked at it, looked at me, said, "Keep moving," in a voice that had lost the analytical curiosity from 20 minutes earlier, and settled into something flatter, more careful, the voice of a person deciding consciously not to let a strange detail slow down a search that still had a missing person at the center of it. We picked up the pace again, calling Marcus's name every 100 yards or so. The sound swallowed fast by rain and canyon both, and for a stretch of maybe 20 minutes the wash behaved itself completely. Ordinary scour, ordinary debris, ordinary downhill water doing exactly what water is supposed to do. And I let myself believe, briefly, that we'd seen the strangest part of the night already, and the rest of it would simply be the hard physical work of finding a cold, frightened man and getting him out. That belief lasted until we reached a narrow pour-off about a mile short of where we'd eventually find him, where the flood's main channel had clearly funneled through a gap barely 4 feet wide before opening back out below. On the downstream side of that gap, where physics says the water's full force should have scoured everything clean, we found instead a single, unbroken line of undisturbed sand, dry despite the rain still falling on it, running in a straight band, directly across what should have been the flood's entire path, as though the water had simply declined to touch that one strip of ground while tearing through everything on either side of it. Denise stood over it for a long moment with her headlamp before saying, quietly, more to herself than to me, "That's not a back eddy. I don't have a word for that one." We found Marcus at 11:40 that night, alive, hypothermic, sitting on a ledge about 11 feet above the current channel bed, in a spot our maps said the floodwater should never have been able to reach, too high, too far from the main drainage line, protected by a rock shelf that should have kept that section bone dry even in a 100-year flood event. He was soaked to the skin, shivering hard enough that his first attempts to speak came out as mostly consonants, and it took Denise a full minute of steady, calm talking before he settled enough to answer questions clearly. I climbed up to reach him while Denise stayed below coordinating with dispatch, and the climb itself told me something worth noting later. The ledge wasn't a difficult scramble, maybe class 3 at worst, but every hold on the way up was bone dry. No residual dampness, no debris caught in the cracks. Nothing to suggest that 11 feet of moving water had recently occupied the space directly below it. Marcus, when I reached him, was undeniably soaked through, his clothes heavy with water that had to have come from somewhere. And yet the rock under and around him told a story that flatly contradicted the one his own body was telling. He flinched when my headlamp beam caught him, and for a second before recognition set in, I watched him brace the way people brace when they've spent hours being startled by things that turned out not to be help arriving. Then he saw the uniform, the patch on my shoulder, and something in his shoulders came down all at once. The particular collapse of a person who has been holding themselves together by sheer will and has just been given permission to stop. "You're real," he said, which struck me as an odd thing to say to a rescuer, and which I understood completely anyway, without needing him to explain it further right then. He told us, once he could, that the water had found him fast, faster than he could process, and that his memory of the next few minutes wasn't the kind he trusted to explain properly. The way memory gets slippery under real fear. In a way it never quite does in the retellings people practice afterward. He said the current had picked him up low in the wash, the way you'd expect, and that everything that happened after should have carried him downstream, toward the river, toward easier ground. Instead, he said, it felt like the water was pushing him up. Not swirling him, not bouncing him off rocks the chaotic way floodwater does when it's doing what floodwater does, pushing steadily uphill until it set him down on that ledge and receded. And he sat there for 4 hours too afraid to move in case the ground underneath him decided to do something else he didn't have a word for. He described the sensation more than once, trying different phrasing each time as though hoping one version might finally sound less impossible than the last. Not like being carried by a current, he said, but like being set on an escalator running the wrong way through open water, steady, mechanical, entirely without the chaos a real flood current has, the tumbling and the disorientation and the constant fight to keep your head above the surface that every water rescue training video drills into you to expect. He said there was no fight in it at all. The water simply decided where he was going. And he went. Denise asked him gently whether he'd hit his head, whether he'd lost consciousness at any point, standard questions for anyone describing a flood experience that doesn't match the physical evidence, looking for the ordinary explanation before reaching for anything else. He said no, firmly, almost defensively, and then softened and admitted that he understood exactly why she was asking, that he'd have asked the same thing in her position, and that he wished more than anything that a knock on the head were the answer. Because it would be so much easier to accept than the alternative, which was that he'd been entirely conscious and entirely correct about what he'd felt. We got him into a litter, packaged for the carryout, and while Denise ran his vitals, I did a slow sweep of the ledge and the drop below it with my headlamp. Mostly out of the same reflex that makes you check a room twice even after you've already found what you came for. What I found was a scatter of small stones on the ledge itself. The same loose, sorted arc we'd seen at the side pool, a quarter-mile back, sitting neatly around Marcus like the tide line of a pool that had never actually reached that high, except by every account his included water very clearly had. By the time the extraction team reached the trailhead with him just after 2 in the morning, 3 separate rescue members had independently noted the same thing about the debris field scattered along that stretch of canyon. Every branch, stone shifted by the flood's force. Every scrap of drift material sat on the high side of whatever it had lodged against, or arranged in the same strange sorted arcs we'd found twice already. Not one piece of physical evidence in that canyon matched a flood that had run the direction gravity says floodwater has to run. We got Marcus into a litter and began the 2-person lower back down off the ledge. A slow, careful process on ground. None of us wanted to rush given how the climb up had already behaved, and by the time we reached the canyon floor, the second team, Denise had called in from the county's technical rescue squad, was waiting with a wheeled litter carrier to ease the rest of the carryout. Marcus stayed mostly quiet during the lower, occasionally repeating some version of the same sentence. It pushed me up. I know how that sounds. It pushed me up. Less to us at that point than to himself. The way people rehearse an account they weigh. Already suspect nobody's going to fully accept. The carryout itself took almost 2 hours, 4 of us rotating litter duty across ground that alternated between slick mud and loose scree, rain easing to a drizzle, and then stopping entirely somewhere around 1 in the morning, the canyon settling into the particular hush that follows a flash flood once the main pulse of water has passed through and drained away. No birdsong yet, nothing but dripping rock and the sound of our own boots and Marcus's occasional low murmur as he drifted in and out of a shallow, exhausted half-sleep on the litter. We passed both anomalous debris sites again on the way out, in the same order, and I noticed, though I didn't mention it to anyone at the time, that the dry, undisturbed sand strip at the narrow pour-off was still there, still dry, even though that drizzle had by then been falling steadily on every other surface in the canyon for the better part of an hour. Denise walked point the whole way, calling out footing for the rest of us in the same flat, competent voice she'd used since 8 o'clock that evening. And if she was thinking about the sorted stones and the uphill debris the way I was, she didn't say so, not once. Not until we were both back at the ranger station with dry clothes and coffee, and enough distance from the canyon to say things out loud that don't sound reasonable inside it. The formal debrief happened 2 days later, in a conference room at Panther Junction with a whiteboard, still bearing the ghost of someone's schedule from an unrelated meeting, half erased. Denise had prepared a full timeline beforehand, photographs organized by location and timestamp, GPS tracks overlaid on a topo printout, the kind of thorough documentation that made it clear, without her needing to say so, that she wanted this properly examined rather than quietly waved off. The incident commander, a district veteran named Ruiz who'd run more flash flood debriefs than anyone else on staff, walked through the timeline point by point, asking careful questions, taking his own notes in a small spiral pad he'd apparently carried to every debrief for the past decade. Ruiz had a reputation in the district for being almost aggressively unimpressed by strange details, the kind of supervisor who'd spent enough years hearing dramatic accounts of ordinary incidents that his default position on anything unusual was patient, thorough skepticism. He asked Denise 3 separate times to walk him through exactly how she'd measured the debris sorting at the side pool, whether wind could plausibly account for it, whether an earlier, unrelated hiker could have disturbed the site before we arrived. Each question was fair. Each answer, when Denise gave it, closed off one more ordinary explanation without opening up anything that felt like relief. By the 4th or 5th round of this, I noticed Ruiz had stopped writing in his spiral pad and was simply listening, which from him was its own kind of admission. The district hydrologist looked at our photographs 2 days later and gave us the answer everyone in that debrief room wanted, the one that lets you close a report and move on to the next call. Debris fields in narrow slot terrain can shift during recession, when water drains back out faster than it came in, and a receding flow can redeposit material in directions that look wrong to the naked eye if you don't know exactly what you're looking at. It's a real phenomenon. It's documented, cited in 2 papers she pulled up on her laptop right there in the meeting, complete with diagrams of recession phase eddies doing exactly the kind of counterintuitive redistribution she was describing. It was, on paper, more than enough, and I watched most of the room visibly relax as she said it, the particular relief of an explanation arriving on schedule. I raised the dry sand strip at the narrow pour-off, the one that had stayed dry through both the flood and the drizzle afterward, and watched the hydrologist's confidence falter for the first time that morning. She didn't have a recession phase explanation ready for that one. She offered instead the possibility that the strip sat on a slightly raised lens of more permeable substrate that could have drained unusually fast, faster than the eye could track in the dark with a headlamp. Which was possible, she said, though. She'd want to see it in daylight before she'd put her name on it in a report. Nobody scheduled that daylight visit. 6 months later, as far as I know, nobody ever has. What it didn't explain, and what nobody in that room brought up twice, was Marcus's altimeter. He'd been wearing a wrist unit that logs barometric elevation automatically, the same kind half our search team carries, and when Denise pulled the data off it during his medical intake, the log showed him gaining just over 30 feet of elevation. In the 4 minutes he described being carried by the flood, climbing according to the instrument on his own wrist, while the water was supposedly doing nothing but what water does, which is fall. Denise raised it once, carefully, framed as a question about instrument calibration, rather than an accusation, against the hydrologist's tidy explanation, and got a brief, professional answer about barometric pressure fluctuations during storm systems. That could plausibly account for a reading error of that size. Plausibly. Nobody in the room, including the hydrologist, sounded fully convinced by the word as they used it. Denise printed that elevation log anyway, and kept a copy in her own field notebook, not the official file. She's told me since that she still isn't sure why she did that, only that it felt like the kind of detail a file might eventually smooth over, folded into a footnote about instrument error until nobody remembered to ask about it at all. And she didn't want it smoothed over quite that easily. She's also told me, only once, late on a slow winter shift with nobody else in the station, that she went back through the district's own hydrology records afterward, looking for any other flood report in Big Bend's history that mentioned debris, running against the grade, and found exactly one from a survey crew in the 1970s, working a different drainage entirely on the far side of the park. A single paragraph noting anomalous post-flood deposition, direction inconsistent with WIS, observed flow before moving on to unrelated sediment data, as if the sentence hadn't happened. She photographed that page too. She has never shown it to me, only described it, the way you describe something you've decided to keep instead of pass along. I asked her once, half joking, whether she thought the two reports were describing the same thing. 40 years and a different canyon apart. She didn't laugh the way I expected her to. She said that flash floods in this park have been surveyed and modeled and rerun through updated software for decades, that the district has more data on these drainages than almost any comparable stretch of desert in the country, and that in all of Iowa, this exact phrase, direction inconsistent with observed flow, appeared exactly twice, 40-some years apart, both times attached to a single paragraph nobody had followed up on. That's not a pattern you'd expect from instrument error, she said. Instrument error doesn't wait 40 years to repeat the same sentence. Then she closed her notebook, the way she always closed a subject she'd decided she'd said enough about for one night, and neither of us brought it up again for a long while. Marcus recovered fully, filed a thank you letter with the district a month later, thorough and grateful and entirely silent on the subject of which direction the water had felt like it was moving, and has not, as far as I know, been back to Fresno Canyon since. I don't blame him. He did, in that letter, include one line that the district administrator who filed it apparently found touching enough to read aloud at a staff meeting, not knowing what it would mean to the two of us who'd actually been there. He wrote that whatever had carried him up onto that ledge, he'd come to think of it, in the months since, less as something that had almost killed him, and more as something that hadn't let him drown. Denise didn't say anything when the line was read out loud. Neither did I. Denise transferred to a different district 18 months later, closer to family, and we still trade messages now and then, mostly ordinary ones, though every so often, after a big storm somewhere in her new district, she'll send me a single line, asking whether anything came through strange, and I always know exactly what she means without her needing to say more. So far, the answer has always been no. I've noticed, without ever quite deciding to, that I still check. Ruiz, for his part, never did put anything beyond recession phase redistribution, cause undetermined into the official incident file, and I don't fault him for that. A file that tried to capture the full shape of that night would need a category the incident reporting system simply doesn't have. And inventing one, I understand now in a way I didn't fully understand then, would only invite a level of scrutiny that helps nobody, not Marcus, not Denise, not the next ranger who has to walk into that canyon during the next storm and do the job regardless of what did or didn't happen there before. I go back to Fresno Canyon most seasons, because it's the job, and because the wash always looks the same in daylight. Dry, ordinary, running downhill exactly the way a wash is supposed to. Gravel and creosote, and the long, patient geology of a desert that has been eroding toward the river for longer than any of us can meaningfully imagine. I've hiked past the narrow pour-off a dozen times since that night, in full sun, in ordinary weather, and it has looked every single time exactly like what the map says it is. An unremarkable gap in the rock. Nothing about it suggesting it has ever done anything other than what gravity requires of it. It's only after a real flood, standing over a fresh debris line with a headlamp and enough rain still falling to keep the sound going, that I find myself checking twice which side of the rocks the water actually chose, and crouching a little longer than the job strictly requires before I let myself believe what the evidence in front of me is telling me it did. I've never told this story with an ending, because it doesn't have one. Not the kind people generally want from a story like this. Nobody was hurt beyond what the ordinary danger of the terrain accounts for. Nobody saw anything they could put a clear shape to. What we have instead is a debris field that pointed the wrong way, an altimeter log that climbed when it should have fallen, a strip of sand that stayed dry through rain and flood alike, and two rangers who still, years later, feel the small, specific unease of a headlamp beam landing on a canyon wall that has never once given either of them a reason to distrust it, and has also never quite earned back the trust it had before that July. Most nights out here, the canyon behaves. It runs the direction it's supposed to run, deposits what it carries where physics says it has to deposit it, and gives nothing back to a tired ranger with a headlamp except the plain, solvable difficulty of getting a person safely out of difficulty of getting a person safely out of difficult terrain. But I've stopped assuming that's a guarantee. Some nights, in some washes, for reasons nobody on staff has ever managed to write into a report that survives its own debrief, the water seems to remember that it doesn't owe the slope anything at all. The call came in through Montrose Dispatch at 9:47 in the evening, the kind of hour when day trips have either ended or gone wrong. Two names on a self-issued permit: Owen Castellano and Priya Nair, canyoneering the painted wall side of Black Canyon of the Gunnison. Expected topside by 7. 2 hours late wasn't unusual. 4 hours, in a canyon that swallows radio signal and cell coverage both, was the number that gets a ranger out of bed. The permit itself told us most of what we needed before we ever left the trailhead. Both experienced, both with prior canyoneering trips logged in the park's voluntary registry, both carrying the standard kit the visitor center recommends and half the day users ignore: headlamps with spares, an emergency bivvy each, a printed topo. No reliance on cell signal because there isn't any past the rim. It was the kind of permit that made dispatch hesitate before escalating, the sort of profile that usually means a late return, not a real emergency. A friend of Priya's had been the one to call it in, worried enough to phone the park directly at 4 hours overdue rather than wait for full dark to make the decision for her. And that single act of someone caring enough to call early was, we didn't later agree, probably the reason both of them walked out of that canyon at all. I was on backcountry duty that week, which in Black Canyon means you know the inner gorge better than most people know their own house, and you still don't trust it. The canyon isn't wide. In places you can throw a rock across it, but it drops 2,300 feet from rim to river, sides so steep the sun only touches the bottom for about 33 minutes a day. Even with headlamps, the descent routes are not forgiving. We call these rescues vertical, and we mean it literally. There is no gentle version of getting a person out of that gorge. There is only the correct rope system, done correctly, and enough patience to do it slowly. I'd been at the park a little over 6 years by then, long enough to have stopped being afraid of the canyon in the ordinary sense, and long enough to have replaced that fear with something quieter and more useful. A kind of respect that keeps you checking your anchors twice instead of once. My first season, a visitor fell 40 feet off the Warner route, trying to get a photograph without a permit, without water, without telling anyone where he was going. He lived. Most of them do, if the fall is short enough, and the landing is wrong in exactly the right way. I remember standing over him waiting for the helicopter. listening to the canyon do what it always does at night, which is turn every small sound into 3 sounds, and thinking that I would never fully understand this place, only manage it. There's a book kept in the district office, older than any of the current staff, a hardbound logbook nobody has ever formally retired that rangers still call the Night Ledger, though its actual title on the spine is just Incident Notes, Vol. 4 through whatever volume is current now. Most of it is exactly what you'd expect. Dates, names, weather, outcomes, the dry administrative language of a job that has to be defensible on paper. But every so often, maybe 4 or 5 times a decade, an entry ends with a line that isn't quite administrative. A small unresolved detail the writing ranger clearly didn't know what else to do with. A voice heard from a direction no one occupied. A radio transmission logged before it was sent. A single sentence once from 1989 that just says, found his gear half-mile past where he said he turned back, and no way down to it that doesn't require rope he didn't have. If you're still awake, now's the moment to subscribe. In an hour you won't want to move. Then the next one finds you on its own. Where were we? I'd read through those volumes on slow winter shifts more than once, the way you read anything strange enough to keep you company, and I'd always filed it the way everyone files it. Coincidence, fatigue, a canyon old enough and deep enough that a certain percentage of its stories were never going to resolve cleanly, and that was fine, because they were somebody else's stories, from some other year, some other ranger's shift. Dale Ferris met me at the equipment cache with the department pickup already running. 22 years with the park. The kind of ranger who'd rappelled into this gorge more times than he could count, and had stopped being impressed by it somewhere around year 3. He didn't talk much on drive-outs. He'd learned, the way you learn anything after 2 decades, that most of what needs to be said on the way to a rescue is logistics. And logistics don't need conversation, they need a checklist. We ran that checklist at the Warner Point trailhead under 2 headlamps and 1 hanging shop light clipped to the tailgate. Harnesses. Static rope, 200 feet, plus a second bag in reserve. A haul system, pre-built, because building one in the dark on a ledge is the kind of thing you want to have already done at home in daylight. Headlamps, spares, batteries taped in 3s. An overnight pack each, in case the extraction ran past dawn, which in this canyon it often does. Dale checked my harness. I checked his. Neither of us skipped that step. Not once in 6 years, because the one time you skip it is the one time it matters. We started down the cruise gully route just after 11, the access chute that drops fast through the first 400 feet before it opens onto the traverse ledges that carry you the rest of the way to the river. The night was warm for July. The kind of warm that means storms are building somewhere out past the rim, even if you can't see them yet. No rain on us. Not yet. Dale rigged the first anchor at the chute's lip while I fed rope, both of us moving through the sequence the way you move through anything you've done 1,000 times, hands finding the right piece of gear before your eyes confirm. It's the right piece, voice calling out on rappel, on belay, off rappel, in the same flat cadence every time, because the flatness is the point. Excitement in your voice on a night descent means something's wrong. We keep it flat so that, if it ever isn't flat, the other person knows immediately, without having to ask. Partway down the chute, clipped into a directional and waiting for Dale to clear the next station, I asked him, mostly to fill the silence, whether he'd ever worked a rescue down here that didn't add up afterward. He was quiet long enough that I thought the wind had eaten the question, and then he said, without turning around, that every ranger who stays in this canyon long enough collects 1 or 2, and that the trick wasn't refusing to have them. It was refusing to let them change how carefully you did the job the next time. Canyon doesn't owe you an explanation, he said. Owes you a live body at the trailhead. That's the whole contract. Then he clipped into the next anchor and called down that he was off rappel. and neither of us said anything else about it for the rest of the descent through the chute. The canyon at night doesn't feel empty. It feels attended. I've tried to explain that to visitors who ask what it's like down there after dark, and the closest I've ever gotten is this. Imagine a room just barely too small for the number of people standing in it, except the room is a mile long and there's no long. And there's no one else in it at all. Sound does strange things in a space shaped like that, even on an ordinary day. The walls are close enough and hard enough. Precambrian gneiss and schist. Some of the oldest exposed rock in North America, polished by 2 million years of river, that a shout can arrive at your ear from 3 directions before it arrives from the one you're actually facing. Rangers get used to it. You learn not to trust your ears for direction, only for confirmation that a sound happened at all. About 400 feet down, on the first flat traverse ledge, Dale keyed his radio to check in with dispatch. Standard practice. Every 15 minutes on a night descent, so that if we go quiet, someone topside starts the clock on a second team. Before he'd finished pressing the button, before a single word had left his mouth, I heard dispatch's voice come back through his radio, clear and calm, giving exactly the kind of ETA update Dale was about to ask for. Copy that. Be advised your ETA to the river matches previous estimate. Over. Dale looked at me. He hadn't said anything yet. His thumb was still on the transmit button. We wrote it off, both of us, the way you write off a thing at 11 at night in a canyon already known for doing strange things to radio signal. A delayed echo of some earlier transmission from another team, bounced wrong off basalt, arriving out of order, maybe crossed with a repeater glitch up on the south rim. It happens more than people think, or at least that's what we told each other. Dale keyed up properly a second later, gave his actual position, and dispatch answered normally. No repeat, no delay, no strangeness at all. We kept moving, and for a while the canyon behaved exactly the way a canyon is supposed to behave, which is to say it did nothing, and said nothing, and simply waited. The traverse ledges past that point narrow before they widen again, a section every ranger who works this route calls the neck. Not because it's technically difficult, but because it's the place where the canyon walls lean, in close enough that your headlamp beam hits rock on both sides at once, and the sound of your own breathing starts to sound like it's coming from somewhere behind you. Dale went first through the neck, the way he always did. Not because rank required it, but because he liked to be the one who found out first if something was wrong. Halfway through, he stopped. Not suddenly. Dale didn't do anything suddenly, but with the particular stillness of a person listening hard enough that moving would cost them something. I stopped behind him and listened too, and for a few seconds there was nothing but the ordinary night sounds of a canyon. Wind moving high above us along the rim, the far-off suggestion of the river. A single rock somewhere shifting the half-inch. That rocks shift when nobody's watching. Then low, almost under the wind, footsteps. Not our own. We'd both gone still. But the unmistakable, unhurried rhythm of someone walking on gravel, coming from further down the traverse, from the direction we hadn't reached yet. Search and rescue, Dale called out. Standard protocol, loud enough to carry, calm enough not to startle anyone who might be out there disoriented and scared. Owen, Priya, call out if you can hear me. Nothing answered. The footsteps didn't answer either. They simply stopped, the way footsteps stop when a person reaches level ground, and didn't start again. We covered that stretch of ledge slowly, headlamps sweeping every ledge and overhang wide enough to hold a person, and found nothing. No footprints in the thin gravel that should have shown at least a partial track. No gear, no dropped item, no sign that anyone had passed through the neck ahead of us at all that night. Dale didn't say what I was thinking, which was that the two of us were the only search team in the canyon at that hour. and that whatever had made that sound had made it from a direction neither of the missing canyoneers' last known position nor our own approach could account for. He didn't say it because saying it out loud at 11:40 at night, 400 feet down a gorge with 1,800 more to go, wouldn't have helped either of us move faster or think more clearly. So instead he just said, "Rockfall, probably." And I said probably, and we both knew neither of us believed it. We gave the ledge one more pass anyway, methodical. The way you're trained to search a space you already believe is empty. Because belief isn't evidence, and the search protocol doesn't care what you believe. Dale took the wall side, running his light low across the gravel looking for any disturbance in the thin, undisturbed dust that collects on these ledges between rains. I took the outer edge, checking the drop for anything that might have gone over. A dislodged stone, a scuffed lip, anything. We found one thing between us, and it was small enough that if either of us had been moving faster, we'd have missed it. A patch of gravel, roughly boot-sized, noticeably darker than the dust around it, as though something had rested there recently. Enough to block the pale coating of rock flour that settles on everything else in this canyon within a day or two of exposure. No print. No tread pattern. Just an absence, boot-shaped, where the dust hadn't had time to finish falling. Neither of us photographed it for the report. I've wondered since why not. We photograph everything. It's reflexive by that point in a career. And the only answer I've ever landed on is that some part of both of us didn't want it to be a permanent thing. Written down, filed, real, in the way that photographs make things real. We kept walking, because that's the job. You keep walking, you keep the pace steady, and you let the explaining wait until there's coffee and daylight and other people around to help you decide what you actually heard, and saw, and chose not to write down. The rest of the traverse past the neck went the way traverses are supposed to go. Slow, deliberate, unremarkable. The canyon settled back into its ordinary registry of sounds, wind and river and the occasional far-off tick of cooling rock. And by the time the ledges opened out onto the wider approach above the river corridor, both of us had let our shoulders down half an inch without quite deciding to. Dale radioed dispatch with an updated position, and dispatch answered normally, on time, no premonitions. And I remember being almost embarrassed by how much that small, correct exchange settled my stomach. We reached the river a little after 1 a.m, close to 2 hours behind the pace we'd planned, most of it lost to the slow, careful search of the neck that had turned up nothing. The canyoneer's gear cache was exactly where the permit said it would be. Dry bags lashed to a boulder, a change of clothes folded with more care than most people manage at home, a coiled retrieval rope looped neatly and coiled clockwise. The kind coiled clockwise. A tidy setup that told you these were people who knew what they were doing before anything went wrong. No sign of a fall. No blood, no torn webbing, no snapped gear. Nothing to suggest the technical kind of accident this terrain usually produces when canyoneers make a mistake on rappel. What we found instead was one headlamp, switched on, lying in 3 inches of water at the river's edge, beam pointed upstream into the dark. Batteries still good, the light steady and strong, which told us it hadn't been there long. Headlamps in river water don't last. Dale picked it up, turned it toward the canyon wall out of habit more than purpose, and that's when we both heard it. A second voice, distant, echoing off the walls on the far side of the river, calling a name. Priya. It was Owen's voice. We were sure of that later, once we'd found him and heard him speak in person. Matched the register and the particular way he stressed the second syllable. But at 1:14 in the morning, when we heard that call, Owen was not yet within 400 meters of where we stood. He would tell us so himself, hours afterward, matching his own GPS track against the timestamp in Dale's rescue log with something close to disbelief, tracing the line on the little screen, with one finger like he was trying to make the numbers say something different. We split the search from the river, Dale taking the near bank downstream. Me taking the far crossing upstream toward the direction the voice had come from. Both of us staying on radio. Both of us calling out every 30 seconds the way you're right. Train 2. Name, then pause. Then name again, giving anyone disoriented enough time to place the sound and answer. For the better part of an hour, the canyon gave us nothing back but our own calls returning flattened and doubled off the rock. The crossing itself took longer than it should have. That stretch of the Gunnison runs a braided channel there, split around a long gravel bar, shin deep in the near arm and better than waist deep in the far one. Cold enough in July that you feel it as a kind of pressure behind your knees before you. Feel it as temperature. I went across roped to a static line Dale had anchored before I left. Standard protocol for any river crossing at night, regardless of how confident you feel about the depth, because confidence is exactly the thing that gets people swept in water that cold. On the far bank, I called back that I was across, safe, continuing on foot, and Dale's voice came back thin, small with distance. The first time all night the canyon's acoustics had behaved the way you'd actually expect them to. A voice getting quieter as the person speaking got farther away. Nothing more mysterious than physics doing its ordinary job. That small, correct piece of ordinary physics was, I remember thinking at the time, oddly comforting. I held on to it for the better part of the next hour, the way you hold on to any small proof that the world is still following its usual rules. Right up until I found the headlamp resting deliberately on its flat stone in the eddy, and the boot print. Pressed into the mud beside it, pointed the wrong way entirely. Then, upstream, in a shallow eddy where the current pooled slow enough to reflect starlight, I found the second headlamp. Off this time, resting on a flat stone above the waterline, deliberately placed rather than dropped. The way you'd set something down if you meant to come back for it. Beside it, pressed into the mud, a single boot print. Toe pointed downstream, back toward the way we'd come, back toward the neck. I radioed Dale the position and the print, and he told me something that made the hair go up on the back of my neck in a way 6 years in this canyon hadn't managed before. He'd found a matching print 20 minutes earlier, on his side of the river. Same tread pattern, toe pointed the same direction. Downstream, toward me, toward the print I'd just found pointed at him. 2 prints from the same boot, on opposite banks of a river neither person could have crossed without leaving some trace of the crossing, both pointed toward each other like the start of a conversation that hadn't happened yet. I crouched over the print for a full minute before moving on, doing the math the way you can't stop yourself from doing it, even when you know it won't resolve into anything useful. The Gunnison at that stretch runs cold and fast even in July. Snowmelt fed, chest deep in the channel and worse in the pools. The kind of crossing you don't attempt without a rope system and a plan. Not in the dark, not solo, not in the state either of these 2 people was reportedly in by that hour. There was no rope strung across. No sign of a swim. No wet drag marks on either bank, no disturbed cobble where a person might have hauled themselves out gasping. Just the 2 prints, dry, clean-edged, pointed at each other across 60 feet of moving water, as though whoever left them had simply arrived on each bank already standing there. We didn't say much about it over the radio. There's a discipline to rescue communication that keeps you from speculating out loud on an open channel, because dispatch is listening, because a family member might eventually read the transcript, because speculation isn't information, and information is the only thing that keeps people alive down there. So Dale said, copy, matching print. We'll advise, and I said the same. And we kept moving. Faster now. Both of us wanting this to be over before we had time to think too hard about what wasn't adding up. We found Priya first, curled against a boulder in a patch of sand about 60 yards further up. Awake, shivering, one ankle wrapped in a torn strip of shirt sleeve in a way that told me she'd handled her own first aid before anyone reached her. She saw my headlamp before she saw me and started crying, the relieved kind. The kind that comes out sideways because you've been holding a straighter kind of fear for Hours, and your body doesn't know how to switch gears cleanly. Owen went to find you, she said, before I'd even gotten close enough to check her pulse. He heard someone calling back. He said, "Stay here," so I stayed here. I told her I hadn't seen him, that I'd heard a voice calling her name from this direction almost an hour ago, and watched her face do something complicated. Relief curdling fast into a confusion she didn't have words for yet. "That was him," she said. "That was definitely him. But he left before that. He left before we heard anything." We found Owen 40 minutes later, a little over half a mile upstream from Priya, in a spot our maps marked as a dead-end pour-off. Terrain that shouldn't have been reachable on foot from where he'd started without technical gear. He didn't have without technical gear, he didn't have without him. He was alive, hypothermic, disoriented in the specific glassy way people get after being cold and frightened for too many hours in the dark. But unhurt beyond the ordinary scrapes the canyon leaves on anyone who spends a night arguing with it. He told us, teeth chattering hard enough that Dale had trouble getting a clean pulse reading on him, that after Priya went down with her ankle, he'd made the call to leave her in a sheltered spot and go find help, following the sound of what he was on. Certain were rescuers already in the canyon, calling both their names, moving with the calm professional cadence of people who do this for a living. He said the voices had led him upstream, away from the route out, deeper into terrain that got harder instead of easier, until the voices stopped and he realized he was farther from help than he'd been when he started. "I know how that sounds," he said more than once in the flat, careful voice of a person pre-defending a story he already suspects nobody will fully believe. "I know exactly how that sounds. I'm telling you what I heard." What made both of their accounts hard to file away as simple panic and echo. The way you want to file this kind of thing away so you can close the report and sleep, was how precisely they matched each other, and how precisely they matched details. Neither of them could have known. Owen described hearing a voice call out, clearly, "She's got an ankle," a full 20 minutes by his own estimate, before Priya actually went down on the loose scree that caused the injury. Priya, separately, before we'd told her anything about what Owen had said, described hearing a man's voice repeating Owen's exact position back to her. Coordinates she didn't understand until Dale later matched them, nearly exactly, to the GPS fix. His radio logged for Owen 40 minutes after she said she heard them. Dale interviewed Priya himself while I sat with Owen. Standard practice. Separate the accounts before they can start borrowing details from each other. He told me afterward that she'd described the voice with an odd specificity. Not urgent, not shouting the way a real searcher shouts when they're worried, but level, almost bored, the way dispatch sounds reading a routine update over the radio at 2 in the morning. Like someone reading off a clipboard, she'd said. And Dale said the phrase had stuck with him because it was almost exactly the same thing he'd have said about the ETA confirmation that beat his own transmission by 4 seconds. Neither of them had spoken to the other's account yet at that point. Neither of them had any reason to reach for the same odd, specific comparison. Owen, for his part, kept circling back to one detail he apologized for repeating, worried it made him sound less credible each time he said it again. That the voice calling him upstream hadn't ever quite sounded like it was behind him or ahead of him, the way a real voice in a canyon settles into one general direction, even with all the echo. It had sounded, he said, like it was keeping pace with him. Like whatever was speaking was walking the route alongside him, matching his stride, staying just close enough to be heard, and just far enough to never be seen, all the way to the dead-end pour-off that should have told any of us, rescuer or lost hiker, that we'd been led somewhere with no way through. Getting them both out took the rest of the night. Priya couldn't walk on the ankle, so we splinted it, packaged her in a litter, and Dale called in the second team we'd staged at the rim to help haul. Because a one-person haul system on a 200-foot vertical pitch is technically possible, and practically miserable, and nobody in this business does something the hard way when the easy way is sitting in a truck 20 minutes out. The second team reached us a little before 4. 3 rangers and a volunteer with the county SAR unit. All of them fresh in a way Dale and I no longer were. And there's a particular relief in watching tired hands hand off a haul line to hands that off a haul line to hands that haven't been working rope since 11 the night before. We built the raising system against a natural anchor point about 30 feet back from the pour-off. Standard 3-to-1 with a progress capture. Everyone calling their steps out loud, the way you do on a system carrying a person. And it took the Roddy better part of 90 minutes to move Priya's litter the 200 vertical feet, back up to the traverse ledge where the terrain leveled enough to switch to a carry. I remember being grateful, in a purely physical way, that had nothing to do with anything we'd seen or heard that night. For the simple, solvable difficulty of rope and friction, and the honest weight of a person you can actually get your hands under. Owen could walk, slowly, with a hand on my shoulder more often than either of us wanted to admit, and talked the entire way up in the particular, over-explaining way people talk when they're trying to convince themselves as much as you that what they experienced makes sense. Dawn found us still on the wall, the sky over the rim going the pale, bruised color it goes before the sun actually clears the canyon edge. And for the first time since 11 the night before, the canyon sounded like an ordinary canyon. Birds starting somewhere below us, wind picking up the way it does when the temperature starts to shift. Our own boots on rock sounding like exactly one set of boots on rock, coming from exactly the direction they should. There's a particular quality to a canyon at first light that I've never fully managed to describe to anyone who hasn't stood in one after a long night. The way the walls that felt close and watchful in the dark simply become walls again, old rock. With nothing behind it, silence, but more old rock. And the relief of that ordinariness is almost its own kind of exhaustion, like setting down a weight you'd stopped noticing you were carrying. We reached the rim a little after 7. Ems met us at Warner Point, checked Priya's ankle and both their core temperatures, cleared them for transport, and by 8:30 they were in a warm ambulance heading toward Montrose, and Dale and I were standing at the tailgate of the same truck. We'd loaded gear out of 9 hours earlier, neither of us saying much, both of us thinking about the same 2 boot prints pointed at each other across a river. Dale finally broke the silence by asking, in the same flat, logistics voice he used for everything, whether I wanted the front seat or the back on the drive to the district office, and I understood that was as close as either of us was going to come. That morning, to saying out loud that neither of us wanted to be alone with what we'd just seen. The formal debrief happened 3 days later, the way it does after any rescue that runs long enough and strange enough to warrant one. The incident commander pulled every radio transmission and every GPS ping from that night and laid them out on a timeline projected against the wall of the district conference room. The same room where we go over rope rigging plans and budget requests and, twice a year, active shooter refreshers nobody wants to sit through. Everyone in that room expected the usual finding, the one that lets you close a file and move on. Canyon acoustics doing what canyon acoustics do, adrenaline and cold and dehydration reshaping memory into something more coherent than what actually happened. Boot prints that on closer inspection belonged to an earlier unrelated hiker and simply hadn't weathered yet. That's still, officially, most of what's written in the report. It's the only explanation that doesn't require rewriting how sound and time are supposed to work. And the Park Service, like most organizations, prefers explanations that don't require that. But nobody in that debrief room had a clean answer for Dale's radio log. His unit records transmissions automatically, down to the 10th of a second, whether or not a human remembers to write anything down afterward. The log showed dispatch's ETA confirmation arriving at 11:1942, 4 seconds before Dale's own outgoing transmission, the one he was in the middle of sending, time-stamped at 11:1946. 4 seconds isn't an echo, and it isn't a delayed repeater bounce. Not according to the two radio technicians the district eventually asked to look at it, both of whom signed off on the equipment as functioning within normal parameters, and then off on the equipment as functioning within normal parameters, and then off. The record admitted they didn't have a mechanism that explained the sequence. 4 seconds is an answer that arrived before the question did. Nobody offered to explain that part out loud. Not in the room, not in the report. The incident commander noted it, filed it under equipment anomaly, unresolved, and moved to the next item on the agenda, which was a scheduling conflict for the following month's swift water recertification. After the room emptied, I stayed behind long enough to ask the district's senior supervisor, a woman who'd worked this canyon for the better part of 3 decades, whether she'd ever heard of anything like it. She didn't answer right away. She went to a shelf behind her desk, pulled down a hardbound logbook I recognized without needing to be told what it was, and opened it to a page she found without much searching, which told me she'd opened it to that page before. It was the 1989 entry. The gear found a half-mile past the turnaround point, no way down to it that didn't require rope the hiker hadn't been carrying. Underneath it, in different ink, someone had added a line years later. See also 23. See also 2011. Page references to 2 more entries I hadn't come across in my own slow winter reading. She closed the book before I could ask to see them. "It's not a pattern," she said. "It's just a canyon old enough to have more than one strange night in it. Don't let it change how you rig a rope." Then she put the book back on the shelf, and I understood the conversation was over, and that I wasn't going to be shown pages 3 and 4. That's usually how these things go here. You write down what you can defend in an official document, and you carry the rest of it home with you, folded up small, the way Dale still does, the way I still do, whenever I'm 400 feet down that gorge at night, and my own radio clicks on A. Half second before I mean it to. Priya and Owen were back on the rim by 8 that morning, warm, fed, checked out, and cleared to arrange their own ride home once family had been called. They thanked us the way people do after a long, strange night. Sincerely, a little shaken, already starting to reshape the story into something they could tell their friends without sounding like they'd lost their minds a little in the dark. Priya sent a card to the district office about a month later, the kind with a photo of the canyon on the front that you can buy at the visitor center gift shop, thanking the team by name and saying, almost as an aside near the bottom, that she still sometimes hears someone say her name right before she falls asleep, and that it doesn't frighten her the way you'd think, only makes her feel, briefly, like someone is keeping track of her. Neither of them has been back to Black Canyon since, as far as the permit records show, and I don't blame them for that. I go back every season because it's the job, because 6 years became 8 became more, and because the canyon doesn't care whether you trust it or not. It simply continues, indifferent, 2,300 feet of old rock doing whatever it does, to sound and time down in the dark, whether or not anyone is there to hear it. Most nights it does nothing. Most nights it is exactly what the map says it is, a gorge, a river, a long way down and a long way back up. But on quiet nights, when the water's low enough to hear yourself think, when the rim above is empty, and the only light down there is whatever I'm carrying, I still find myself listening a half second longer than I need to, before I key my own radio. Waiting, the way you wait for an answer you already suspect is coming before you've finished asking the question, to see whether the canyon gets there first. Dale retired 2 years ago, moved to a cabin outside Ridgeway with a view of the range, and none of the canyon. And the last time I saw him, he told me he still keeps his old radio unit on a shelf in the garage, unpowered, batteries pulled, and that every so often he takes it down, turns it over in his hands, and puts it back without quite being able to say why. I didn't ask him to explain it further. Some things you carry out of a canyon aren't meant to resolve. You just get used to their weight, and you keep doing the job anyway, because the job was never about understanding the place. It was only ever about bringing people home. The call came into the Yosemite cache a little after 2 in the afternoon, radioed down from a party of climbers on a neighboring route who'd watched a slab the size of a car door peel off the wall above them and take a good chunk of a fixed anchor with it. What? Somewhere above that slide, on a route called Chimera, a solo climber named Theo Bragg had been 3 pitches from the top, and the party below hadn't seen him fall, which was the only good news in the report. They also hadn't seen him move in the 20 minutes since, which was the reason for the call. I've worked search and rescue in this valley for 9 years, long enough to know that a Yosemite rockfall report on a summer afternoon usually means one of 2 things. Either someone's badly hurt, or someone's fine and simply too rattled to keep. Climbing and the job doesn't really begin until you've eyes on the person and can tell which one you're dealing with. What made this one different from the start was the sky. There was a cell building fast over the eastern rim of the valley, the kind of vertical, anvil-topped buildup that turns a granite wall into the single most dangerous place in the park inside of an hour. And Command made the call to scramble the team before we had a clean picture of Theo's condition, because waiting for more information wasn't a luxury the weather was going to give us. Yosemite runs its own search and rescue operations separately from most parks, staffed by climbers first and rescuers second. People who live in the valley for the season in an informal camp near Camp 4 that everyone just calls the SAR site. Trading one just calls the SAR site. Trading. Labor and rescue availability for a place to sleep, and a community of people who understand exactly why you'd want to spend your whole summer 3,000 feet up a granite wall instead of anywhere more sensible. I'd come up through that same system myself, years back, before I went full-time with the Park Service. And there's a particular muscle memory to the call-out process that never quite leaves you. The radio crackle over the camp speaker, the specific quality of quiet that falls over a dozen conversations at once when the words rockfall and not moving appear in the same sentence. By the time the call-out reached the cache, 4 of us were already geared up from an unrelated training exercise that morning, which is the only reason we were on the wall as fast as we were. Command gave us the basics over the radio while we hiked. Solo climber, 3 pitches below the top of Chimera, last confirmed alive and conscious by the party who called it in. No confirmed injuries yet. Storm inbound. It's the kind of briefing that tells you almost nothing and everything at once. Almost nothing about what you'll actually find. Everything about how fast you need to move to find it. I paired that afternoon with Maya Lindquist, a YOSAR team leader with the kind of resume that makes younger climbers go quiet when she walks into a briefing. First descents on 3 continents, more big wall rescues than anyone else currently on us. Staff. And a manner so calm under pressure that new rangers sometimes mistake it for indifference until they watch her work a system under real stress and realize the calm is the whole point. We'd worked maybe a dozen rescues together over 4 seasons. This was the first one either of us would still be talking about years later, and not for any reason either of us expected walking up the approach trail. There's a binder kept at the Yosemite cache, unofficial, maintained informally by whoever happens to feel like keeping it going that season, called simply the log. Not a training manual, not an incident report archive, just a running collection of the odd, unresolved details that don't fit anywhere else. A climber on the nose in the 90s who swore his partner's voice came over their 2-way radio a full pitch before the partner actually reached the ledge he was radioing from. A rescue in the early 2000s where 3 separate team members' watches, all synchronized before the operation, disagreed with each other by exactly 11 minutes by the time they reached the summit, and never disagreed again afterward. No wow. Matter how many times anyone checked. I'd read through it on slow shifts the way you read anything strange enough to be good company, filed it the way you file anything you can't use, and hadn't thought about it in months. Maya, hiking the approach trail beside me with 60 pounds of rope and hardware between us, mentioned it herself, unprompted. "Somewhere around the second switchback," said the sky, reminded her of the entry about the 11 minutes. And neither of us said much else about it the rest of the way up, because there wasn't really anything useful to say. I asked her, mostly to keep my mind on something other than the weight of the rope bag, whether she believed any of what was written in that binder, or just found it entertaining the way I did. She thought about it longer than I expected before answering, picking her way over a section of loose scree with the unhurried precision of someone who'd walked this trail 100 times before. She said she didn't believe or disbelieve it exactly. That after enough seasons in a place like this, you stop needing every strange thing to resolve into a yes or a no, and you just start keeping a running list of things you've personally witnessed. That didn't add up, filed separately from the things you can explain, and you let the two lists exist next to each other without forcing them to reconcile. She said her own list had 3 entries on it so far, none of which she'd write down anywhere official, and that she wasn't planning on telling me what they were unless the list ever got a 4th. I remember laughing at that, the nervous kind of laugh you do more for the storm building over the rim than for the joke itself, and neither of us said much else until we reached the anchor point. If you're still awake, now is the moment to subscribe. In an hour you won't want to move. Then the next one finds you on its own. Where were we? We reached the base of Chimera a little after 3, along with 2 more team members, Dov and Sasha, who'd hiked up a parallel trail with the haul bags. The route climbs a mostly featureless dihedral for the first 6 pitches before breaking onto a broader, more broken face where the rockfall had come from, and getting a rescue team to a stranded climber on a route like that means either climbing to him directly, which is slow and exposes more people to the same rockfall hazard that got him stranded in the first place, or rigging a fixed line down from the top and lowering a rescuer to his position, which is faster but requires a hiking approach. Around to the rim, a couple of hours we didn't especially have with that storm building. Command chose the top-down approach, and Maya and I made the hike around, while Dov and Sasha stayed at the base coordinating with the party who'd made the initial call, keeping visual contact with Theo through binoculars and relaying anything they could read from his position and posture. The hike to the rim took 90 minutes at a pace that left both of us breathing harder than either of us wanted to admit to the other, and by the time we reached the anchor point above Chimera, the storm cell that had been building over the eastern rim that afternoon had grown into something with real weight to it, dark at the base, lit intermittently from inside by lightning that hadn't yet found the ground. Dov's updates came over the radio every 10 minutes or so during that hike, steady and specific in the way good ground support is trained to be. Theo still upright, still responsive to shouted questions relayed by a megaphone from the base, sheltering as best he could under a small overhang that offered partial protection from the rock above, but none at all from the wind starting to gust down the face. He hadn't moved from that position in the 2 hours since the slide, which told us plainly enough that whatever was wrong with him, walking wasn't currently an option, and every plan we made on that hike accounted for a full technical package rather than any kind of assisted walkout. We rigged the fixed line fast, checked it twice, checked it a 3rd time, because you always check it a 3rd time on a day like this, and Maya went over the edge first, working the rope in controlled stages, calling her position back to me every 20 feet the way protocol requires and the way 9 years of doing this job have taught both of us to want. Radio silence on this kind of descent being its own particular flavor of unbearable. The anchor itself sat on a broad, relatively featureless slab near the rim, exposed enough that we could see most of the valley floor spread out below in the strange, flattened light that comes just before a storm actually breaks. That particular gray-gold color that makes El Capitan look closer than it is and the meadow look farther. I built a redundant backup anchor while Maya worked her way down. Standard practice anytime you're trusting a single system to hold 2 lives on a wall like this, and found myself checking my watch twice in the space of maybe 4 minutes without quite noticing I was doing it, the way you check a door is locked twice in a row, and can't remember either time afterward. It read 4:52 the first time. It read 4:54 the second. Both times felt, if I'm honest, like they should have read something later, though I couldn't have told you why at the time, and didn't think about it again until much later that night, when the discrepancy between what a watch says and what your watch says and what your body believes stopped being a small, forgettable thing and became the only thing anyone in that valley wanted to talk about. She reached Theo a little before 5, according to her radio log, and got straight to work assessing him while I held the rope system topside and relayed status down to Dove and Sasha at the base. He was conscious, coherent. One ankle almost certainly broken from an awkward stance he'd taken bracing against the slide. Dehydrated and badly frightened, but otherwise intact. The good version of the two possible outcomes we'd been braced for on the hike up. Maya's voice over the radio had the particular brightness rescuers use specifically to be heard by the person they're treating. Reassurance layered over triage, and I remember feeling the whole operation settle onto a track that felt, for those first several minutes, almost routine. What wasn't routine, and what neither of us mentioned to each other until much later, was a detail Maya only told me about after we were both off that wall, and sitting in the med tent at base camp with blankets around our shoulders. She said that in the first few minutes after she reached him, before she'd even finished her initial assessment, Theo told her that he'd already spoken to a second rescuer. A woman, he said, who'd reached him first, checked his ankle, told him help, was close, and then simply wasn't there anymore by the time Maya clipped in beside him. Maya assumed at the time that he was disoriented, dehydrated, possibly concussed from the slide, and didn't push the point, because pushing a scared, injured person on a small ledge with a storm coming in is not how you keep someone calm enough to help you get them down safely. She logged it mentally as a symptom, filed it exactly the way you're trained to file the strange things people say when their body is failing them in small, frightening increments, and moved on to setting up the lowering system. She did ask him one follow-up question, almost reflexively, the kind of clarifying detail you gather without quite deciding to because some part of you is already building a mental timeline for the incident report. She asked how long ago the other woman had been there. Theo told her it had felt like a few minutes, maybe 5, but that he honestly couldn't be sure, because somewhere in the waiting he'd stopped being able to tell how much time was passing at all. Not in the dizzy, disoriented way of someone going into shock, he was careful to clarify even then, scared and shivering on a 2-foot ledge, but in a calmer, stranger way, like time had simply stopped being a thing he needed to track, the way you stop tracking it in the last few minutes before you fall asleep on an ordinary night. Maya told me she remembered thinking at the time that it was an oddly articulate thing for a frightened, injured man to say, and remembered deciding not to think about it any further until there was time to, which there very much was not, with the storm now less than 20 minutes out by her own estimate. Getting Theo off that ledge required a full technical lowering operation, packaging him in a harness with a rescue litter attachment, building a redundant anchor system capable of holding both his weight and Maya's as the attendant, and running a controlled lower down the broken face to a lower ledge system where Dov and Sasha could meet them and continue the descent on foot with an assisted carry. It's slow, deliberate work under the best conditions, methodical by design, because a fast mistake on a vertical face costs you a life and a slow correct choice almost never does. Under a building electrical storm, it's slower still, because lightning protocol on an exposed granite face means constant reassessment. Distance to strikes counted in the gap between flash and thunder. Decisions about whether to pause in a lower exposure stance and wait out the worst of a cell or continue moving because staying put is its own kind of danger. Packaging Theo alone took the better part of what Maya later estimated as 15 minutes, though estimated as doing a lot of work in that sentence, given everything that came after. She splinted the ankle first, working by feel as much as by sight, because the light was going fast under the cloud cover. Then got him into the harness system. Checked every buckle twice the way you're trained to on a body you can't afford to drop. And talked him through what was about to happen in the calm, procedural voice rescuers use specifically because panic is contagious and calm. It turns out mostly is too. Theo told her later he remembered almost none of the packaging itself in any real detail, just fragments. The particular blue of a carabiner she clipped near his shoulder. The sound of rain starting somewhere above them before he felt the first drop. Her voice saying something reassuring he couldn't afterward recall the words to, only the tone. I stayed topside managing the main line, feeding rope in controlled increments as Maya called for it, watching the storm's leading edge finally arrive overhead in full wind first, sharp and cold, then rain in sheets heavy enough to blur my headlamp, beam into a solid cone of white. Then the lightning starting in earnest, flash and thunder close enough together that I stopped bothering to count the gap between them and just kept working, because at that point counting wasn't going to change anything either of us did next. Dov's voice came up from the base every few minutes, calm, steady, confirming visual contact with Maya and Theo whenever the rain let him see them at all, and I remember being grateful, in the specific way you are grateful for small competencies. During a crisis, for how well the whole team was doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. I remember the storm breaking properly sometime after Maya had Theo packaged and the lower underway. Rain first. Hard and sudden the way it comes in the high country. Then the wind. Then a strike close enough that the thunder arrived almost on top of the flash, close enough that everyone topside instinctively crouched lower against the rock without anyone giving the order. I remember calling down to Maya to confirm status, hearing her voice come back tight but steady, confirming she and Theo were continuing the lower to the next stance. And I remember checking my watch out of pure habit, the way you check a watch out of 100 times during an operation like this without really registering the number, and it said 5:40. Getting from that stance to the base involved 2 more lowers and 1 short technical traverse across a section of slab still running with rainwater. Each stage its own small negotiation between speed and caution. Maya's voice a constant steady and caution. Maya's voice a constant steady. Thread over the radio, the whole way down, calling clearances, calling hazards, narrating the descent for Dov and Sasha, the way you narrate any operation you want a ground team ready to respond to instantly, rather than catch up to. I remember rappelling down after them once the main lowering system was no longer load-bearing, my headlamp beam swallowed almost completely by the rain, aware in a distant functional way of being cold and tired and moving on the kind of autopilot. That 9 years of this job builds into you, and not once, not for a single moment during any of it, did any part of me feel like I was 6 hours into anything. I felt like I was maybe 40 minutes in. I felt, if I'm honest, faintly proud of how efficiently the whole operation seemed to be running. The next time I checked it with any real attention, we had Theo on the ground at the base of the route, packaged in a litter, vital stable, Dov already on the radio calling for the ground evacuation team to meet us at the trailhead. Maya was beside me, soaked through, hands still faintly trembling with the particular fatigue that comes after hours of controlled tension finally releasing. I looked at my watch to log the completion time for the incident report, the way you always do, purely administrative, and it said 11:52. I remember standing there doing the arithmetic twice, because the first time didn't make sense. Just under 6.5 hours by every clock at the scene, between the moment I'd checked the time at 5:40 and the moment Theo touched down safely at the base. 6.5 hours of a technical lowering operation that, if you'd asked me to estimate it standing there dripping in the rain, I would have guessed it somewhere between 40 minutes and an hour. The length of time it felt like. Time my body was prepared to account for. The length of time that matched, almost to the minute, what Maya independently guessed when I asked her. Before either of us had looked at a clock. Before either of us knew there was a discrepancy to explain. Dov noticed it before either of us did, which is a detail I've turned over in my head more than once since. He'd been down at the base the whole operation, and when Theo was finally on the ground and stable, Dov made an offhand comment about how relieved he was. The storm had finally broken after the better part of 6 hours, meaning it descriptively, meaning nothing more than a statement about a long, hard afternoon. Maya laughed at first, thinking he was joking, said something like it hadn't been anywhere near that long, and Dov looked at her the particular way you look at someone when you realize they're not joking either, and pulled out his own phone to check the time, and went quiet. We stood there in the rain for a good minute, 4 adults with 4 separate devices. My watch, Maya's watch, Dov's phone, Sasha's radio unit, all of them agreeing with each other. All of them insisting on a timeline. None of us had any internal line. None of us had any internal sense of having lived through. Sasha was the one who finally said out loud what the rest of us were circling. That either every clock and every piece of electronics among the 4 of us had failed in exactly the same direction, by exactly the same margin, which strained belief on its own, or something else had happened to the 6 hours. And none of our instruments were the ones that had gotten it wrong. We waited another 40 minutes at the base for the ground evacuation team to reach us and take over Theo's transport to the trailhead, and I remember that wait more clearly than almost anything else that night, precisely because it was the first ordinary stretch of time all evening that actually felt like what it was. 40 real minutes, standing in the last of the rain as it tapered off. Nobody saying much. All 4 of us occasionally glancing at our own wrists as though a 5th check might produce a different, more comfortable answer. It didn't. The ground team arrived, exactly on the schedule the dispatch log predicted, confirming without meaning to that whatever the wall had done to the 6 of us up above, the rest of the valley's clock had kept running the entire time. Patient and entire time. Unbothered, waiting for the rest of us to catch back up to it. It wasn't just our own sense of elapsed time that didn't add up. Dov and Sasha, who'd stayed at the base the entire operation with a direct line of sight to most of the lower, both independently logged the descent as lasting under an hour in their own field notes, written up separately before any of us compared notes. Timestamps. Sasha, in fact, had been keeping an informal count of lightning strikes visible from her position. A habit she said she'd picked up years ago as a way to stay useful and occupied during a long standby. And her tally, 43 strikes, written down in a small waterproof notebook she still had clipped to her harness when I asked to see it 2 days later. Matched almost exactly with meteorological data showing the cell's actual, full duration. 43 strikes counted by her own hand, in what she was certain, right up until she compared notes with the rest of us, had been well under an hour. The storm itself, according to the weather station data pulled afterward from the valley's monitoring post, had a documented duration of 5 hours and 50 minutes from first lightning strike to last recorded discharge. A duration that matched the missing time almost exactly, close enough that the district's incident review later flagged it as the single most likely explanation, and close enough that none of us who were actually there found it explained anything at all. A storm lasting 6 hours doesn't, on its own, make a rescue team lose 6 hours of felt experience, while their bodies burn through 6 hours of water, and their equipment burns through 6 hours of battery. It only tells you that whatever happened for exactly as long as the sky above us was doing the thing that makes this kind of story sound almost reasonable. Almost like something you could explain if you just found the right adjacent fact to hang it on. What made it impossible to write off as a simple ordinary case of adrenaline distorting everyone's internal clock. The kind of thing that happens in genuinely stressful operations more often than people realize. Minutes compressing under pressure. Until an hour feels like 15, was the physical evidence that didn't care what any of us felt. My headlamp, switched on for the entire operation, showed battery drain consistent with roughly 6 hours of continuous use. Not one. Maya's radio log, time-stamped automatically the same way Dale's had been on a different rescue in a different canyon I'd only heard about secondhand, showed 41 separate transmissions spread evenly across 5 hours and change. Each one a real exchange either of us could recall making. None of them compressed or rushed the way you'd expect if 6 hours of communication had somehow been crammed into one. And Theo's own phone, recovered from his pack still in his pocket, had taken a single photograph automatically when he bumped it during the lower. An accidental shot of rock and rope and rain, EXIF timestamp reading 8:47 in the evening. 3 hours. Into a descent every person present would have sworn, under oath, lasted less than one. Theo's own account, once he was stable enough at the hospital in Mariposa to give one, added a piece none of us had a place to put. He remembered the woman who'd reached him first, still remembered her clearly, days later, described her uniform, her voice, a small scar above one eyebrow he was oddly specific about. And he remembered her telling him something before Maya arrived, that he hadn't mentioned on the wall because it hadn't seemed important in the moment, buried under fear and pain and the ordinary chaos of being rescued. She told him, he said, not to worry about how long it took. She'd told him that where he was for a little while, time was going to be borrowed from somewhere else, and that it would be given back before anyone needed it. He said he'd nodded along the way you nod at anything a rescuer tells you when you're hurt and scared and just grateful someone's there, and hadn't thought about the words again until he was lying in a hospital bed being asked gently by 3 different rangers to account for 6 hours he was certain he hadn't experienced. No member of any search and rescue team assigned to the park that day matched the description Theo gave. Command checked. Every ranger on duty that afternoon was accounted for, logged, radioed, or physically present with another team at the time Theo said she'd reached him. Maya, when she heard the description secondhand, went quiet in a way I'd never seen from her before or since, and when I asked her about it later, all she'd say was that it sounded like someone, and she wasn't going to say who, because saying it out loud would make it a claim instead of a resemblance, and she wasn't ready to make it a claim. I pushed her on it exactly once, a few days after, sitting outside the SAR site with 2 lukewarm coffees between us, and she gave me more than I expected. Maybe because the coffee made it feel less like an official conversation. She said the scar Theo described, above the left eyebrow, matched almost exactly a scar a former YOSAR member named Renata Cole used to have. A rescuer Maya had trained under in her first season, more than a decade back, before Renata died in an unrelated climbing accident on a route in the Boogaboos, nowhere near this valley, nowhere near any of us. Maya said she wasn't telling me this because she believed it meant anything specific. She was telling me because I'd asked, and because it was the honest, complete answer, and because carrying it alone had apparently gotten heavier than she wanted to keep carrying by herself. Neither of us has brought it up since, not directly, though I've noticed she still keeps a small photograph clipped inside her helmet, and I've never asked who's in it, and she's never offered to show me. The formal incident review happened the following week, in a conference room at the Valley District office, with a framed photo of Half Dome on one wall and a whiteboard, still half covered in someone else's unrelated meeting notes on the other. The review committee had the weather data, the battery logs, the radio transcripts, the EXIF timestamp, Theo's hospital statement, and 3 independent verbal estimates of elapsed time that all landed within a few minutes of each other and none of them in a few minutes of each other. Them anywhere close to correct. They did what committees do with a set of facts that don't resolve into a clean narrative. They wrote up the parts that were defensible, noted the parts that weren't with careful neutral language, and recommended no operational changes, since nothing about the actual rescue technique had failed. Theo lived. His ankle healed. The system worked exactly the way the system is supposed to work. What the system couldn't account for was where 5 hours of everyone's evening had gone. And the review, in the end, didn't try very hard to. One member of the committee, a hydrologist on loan from the geology division who'd been included mostly to speak to storm behavior, asked a question near the end of the meeting that nobody had a good answer for, and that I've thought about more than answer for. Almost anything else said in that room. She asked simply whether any of the 4 of us on the operation had eaten or drunk anything during the 6 hours the clocks insisted had happened. All 4 of us said no. None of us had touched food or water once we started the technical portion of the rescue, which under ordinary circumstances for a physically demanding 6-hour operation in the rain should have left every one of us in some meaningful stage of dehydration and caloric depletion by the time we reached the trailhead. None of us were. Maya's own post-incident vitals, taken as routine practice for any operation over 2 hours, showed hydration and blood sugar levels consistent with someone who'd been working hard for perhaps an hour, not 6. The hydrologist wrote that finding down carefully, read it back to make sure she had it right, and didn't offer any theory to explain it, and neither did anyone else in the room. Afterward, in the parking lot, the district's senior operations chief, a man who'd run YOSAR for the better part of 2 decades, and had, by his own quiet admission over coffee once, a small collection of stories he'd never put in any official file, asked Maya and me, off the record, whether we wanted to know what he thought had actually happened. We both said yes. He said he didn't know, not really, but that in 20-some years running rescues on that granite, he'd come to believe the valley occasionally, rarely, generously, lent people time they didn't have enough of, that maybe on certain nights, under certain storms, whatever this place is underneath the rock and the water and the light gives a rescue team the hours it actually takes, quietly, off the books, so that the version everyone remembers living through fits inside a night that felt survivable. He said it without any particular drama, the way you describe a policy rather than a haunting, and then he got in his truck and drove home, and none of us ever brought it up again in any setting more official than that parking lot. Theo sent the park a letter about 2 months later, typed formal, thanking the team by name, and near the bottom, almost as an aside, mentioned that he'd started climbing again. Carefully, shorter routes, nothing exposed enough to strand him overnight, and that he still thought sometimes about the woman with the scar above her eyebrow, and that he'd decided, on balance, he was grateful to her rather than unsettled by her, whoever or whatever she'd been. He hasn't been back to Chimera, understandably. He included one more detail in that letter that the district never officially logged anywhere, because there was nowhere sensible to log it. He wrote that in the weeks after the rescue, back home, going through the ordinary business of healing and physical therapy, and trying to explain the whole thing to friends who mostly just found it a good story to tell at parties, he'd started keeping a private tally of his own, not of lightning strikes, not of hours, but of moments where he simply couldn't account for time passing the way he used to be able to. Small things. A commute that felt like 10 minutes and turned out to be 40. A movie that felt like it ended almost as soon as it started. He was careful to say he didn't think anything was wrong with him, that a doctor had checked and found nothing, that he mostly found the whole pattern more curious than frightening. He just wanted someone at the park to know, he wrote, in case it ever happened to anyone else who came off that mountain, that maybe it doesn't entirely let go of you once it's finished with the emergency part. Maya left YOSAR 2 seasons later for a research posting in Alaska, and the last time we spoke, she told me she still sets 2 watches before any technical operation now instead of 1, synchronized carefully before she starts, purely as a personal habit, purely, she said, and I believed her mostly, for redundancy. Dov stayed on another 3 seasons before moving into a full-time ranger role at a different park entirely, somewhere flat. He told me once, half joking, somewhere without enough vertical relief for anything strange to have room to happen. Sasha still climbs in the valley most summers, still keeps a small waterproof notebook clipped to her harness, and still counts things during long standbys, though she's told me since that she counts differently now, cross-referencing more than one method at once, just in case one of them ever disagrees with the others again. I still work this valley. Most seasons pass without anything that doesn't fit neatly into an incident report. Most rescues take exactly as long as they take, and the clocks agree with the memory, and the memory agrees with the weather station, and everyone goes home having spent precisely the number of hours the night actually contained. But every so often, usually during the big early summer storms, when the light goes that particular bruised color against the granite, and the first strikes start walking across the rim, I find myself doing the arithmetic before I've even decided to, counting the gap between flash and thunder, and underneath that, almost without meaning to, counting some other gap I don't have better language for, waiting to see whether tonight is a night the valley intends to lend us anything, and whether, if it does, it plans on giving the hours back. That's all for tonight. Let the forest fade, let the radios fall silent, and leave every unanswered thing where it belongs, in the darkness, far beyond your door. Thank you for listening to The Insomniac. Rest easy, sleep deeply, and wherever you are, good night.